There's a moment, rare and electric, when an entire nation holds its breath together. Not because of politics, not because of headlines, but because a few of their own are standing at the very edge of something extraordinary, and the whole country is watching, hoping, waiting. That moment came for Britain in February 2026, somewhere between the frozen mountains of northern Italy and the warm living rooms of millions of people back home. And when it passed, it left behind something that nobody quite expected: a record, a legacy, and a message from a prince and princess that somehow made it all feel even more real. The story of Team GB at the Milano Cortina 2026 Winter Olympics did not begin with gold medals or royal messages. It began much earlier, in cold training rinks and on icy slopes, in small gyms and quiet mornings when nobody was watching. It began with athletes who had spent years pouring everything they had into a dream that the rest of the world did not always take seriously. Britain, after all, is not a country most people think of when they picture Winter Olympic glory. It does not have the mountains of Switzerland or the winters of Canada. It does not have the deep-rooted winter sports culture of Norway or Germany. And yet, year after year, a small, determined group of British athletes had been quietly building something special, something that in the winter of 2026 would finally announce itself to the world in the loudest possible way. The Games opened on February 6th in the beautiful, snow-covered landscapes of Milan and Cortina d'Ampezzo. 53 British athletes made the journey to Italy that year, 30 men and 23 women, each carrying with them the weight of their own story, their own sacrifices, their own long road to this moment. Expectations were high. UK Sport, the body that funds British Olympic athletes, had predicted a medal range of 4 to 8, calling it a reflection of the fact that British athletes were more competitive in more sports at a Winter Games than ever before. That was an exciting statement, but few people truly understood just how accurate and how much of an understatement it would turn out to be. It was the skeleton that first set British hearts racing. Matt Weston, a man who had spent years working to become the very best at hurtling headfirst down a frozen track at terrifying speeds, stepped into the Cortina sliding center and delivered a performance that left the rest of the world trailing behind him. He finished a commanding 0.88 seconds ahead of his nearest rivals, Germany's Alex Junk and Christopher Grithier, a gap that, in the world of skeleton, is not just a victory, but a statement. When he stood on the top step of that podium, gold medal around his neck, the moment carried a weight far beyond sport. Weston became the first British male to win Winter Olympic gold since Christopher Dean in 1984, over 40 years earlier. He became the first individual British male to claim gold since Robin Cousins in 1980. The names, the years, the scale of what he had just done, it was almost too much to take in. After crossing the finish line, Weston tried to find the words. He said he literally could not describe it. He had won world championships and European championships before, and yet this blew all of them out of the water. He kept touching the medal just to make sure it was real, because it did not feel real. Those words resonated with millions of people watching from home, because that is what sport does at its best. It creates feelings so big that even the person living them cannot fully explain them. Weston had done that. He had created one of those moments. But Britain was not finished. Not even close. The very next day brought something that nobody in British sporting history had ever seen before. On the snow, not the ice, not the rink, but the actual snow, Charlotte Banks, and who Nightingale stormed to gold in the mixed relay snowboard cross event. It was in the truest sense a historic achievement. Every single gold medal that Great Britain had ever won at a Winter Olympics before that day had been won on ice. Every single one. The skeleton, the bobsleigh, the curling, all ice. But snowboard cross gold? On the actual mountain snow? That had never happened. Banks and Nightingale had just made history in a way that could never be taken away. The road to that gold had not been smooth. Both athletes had struggled in their individual events in the days before, and there had been a quiet frustration building among the British snowboard and ski team as a whole. A week of disappointing results had left a gap between expectation and reality. But in sport, sometimes that pressure becomes fuel. Sometimes a team walks onto the course with nothing left to lose and everything to prove, and that is exactly when magic happens. Banks crossed the line first in the final, arms wide, face lit with a joy that was entirely uncontained. She described the feeling as immense relief, not just for herself, but for the whole team. They had made it. They were Olympic champions. Charlotte Banks was no stranger to making history. In 2021, she had become the first British snowboarding world champion, the first British woman to claim a world title in a winter sport in 85 years. Her journey to that point had been unusual, even by the standards of elite athletes. Born in Hemel Hempstead, she had moved to the Alps as a child and initially represented France in competition before eventually switching to represent Great Britain in 2019. She had won the Crystal Globe, the overall World Cup title, in consecutive seasons. She was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable winter sports athletes Britain had ever produced. And yet somehow Olympic gold had eluded her until that February afternoon in Livigno, where she and Nightingale finally got what they deserved. Nightingale, for his part, had been a key part of the British snowboard cross setup for years. A reliable, technically gifted competitor who had built his reputation through consistency and hard work. The partnership between him and Banks on that relay course was not just about individual talent. It was about trust, timing, and the kind of chemistry that only comes from athletes who have trained and competed together long enough to understand each other's rhythms. When Banks handed off and Nightingale took over, there was a fluidity to it that made the whole thing look almost effortless, even though everyone watching knew that every second of that run had taken years of effort to make possible. Back home, the reaction was one of genuine, collective amazement. People who had never watched snowboard cross in their lives were suddenly glued to their screens, rewatching the final over and over, still not quite believing what they had seen. Social media filled with pride. News channels led their bulletins with the result. And somewhere in among all of it, a quiet but significant truth was beginning to form. This British team was doing something special, something that felt different from anything that had come before. And then, before the country had even fully processed those 2 golds, came a third. Matt Weston was back on the ice. This time, alongside 22-year-old Tabitha Sturcker in the skeleton mixed team event. Sturcker was competing at her first ever Winter Olympics, a young woman stepping into one of the most high-pressure environments in sport with relatively little Olympic experience. But she did not look like someone who was overwhelmed. She looked like someone who belonged. Together, she and Weston fought through a nail-biting competition that came down to the finest of margins. They won by just 0.17 seconds, a gap so small it barely seems like a gap at all, and yet it was enough. Another gold, another piece of history. The implications of that victory rippled in multiple directions at once. Weston became the first British athlete to win 2 medals at the same Winter Olympics. That, in itself, was extraordinary. But the result also made Sturcker the 3rd British female skeleton racer in history to win Olympic gold, following in the footsteps of Amy Williams in Vancouver in 2010 and the legendary Lizzie Arnold, who had stood on top of the podium in both Sochi 2014 and Pyeongchang 2018. To be placed in that company at her very first Olympics said everything about what Sturcker had achieved and everything about how far British skeleton had come as a program. 3 golds, 3 pieces of history, and the games were not even over yet. With the curling still to come and the country riding a wave of excitement that had been building for days, Britain went into the final stretch of the Milano Cortina Games with something that felt almost unfamiliar, genuine, justified confidence. The athletes had delivered. The team had shown up. And now, from Kensington Palace, 2 people who had been watching all of it very closely were about to make their feelings known. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had not been quiet observers during the games. William, in his role as patron of GB Snowsport, had actually traveled to Italy to be present at the snow events, to stand at the side of the course, and cheer his athletes on in person. He had been there for Banks and Nightingale's gold, physically there in the crowd, watching history happen from a few feet away. His presence was not ceremonial. It was personal. It was the presence of a man who genuinely cared about the people competing and the cause they were representing. But it was what happened next, what William and Catherine did together from home when the curling team reached their own historic moment, that would move the story into a new chapter entirely. Long before the curling team ever stepped onto the ice in Italy, their story had already touched royalty. It had happened quietly, almost without fanfare, in the months leading up to the games, at Scotland's National Curling Academy, where Prince William and Catherine had visited, pulled on their gear, and spent time with the athletes in person. They had walked into that building not as distant figureheads arriving for a photo opportunity, but as two people who were genuinely curious, genuinely engaged, and genuinely interested in the men and women they were meeting. They had spoken with the players. They had watched them train. They had, in the way that only real personal contact can, formed a connection with these athletes that would give their eventual public message a warmth and authenticity that no press release ever could. That visit mattered more than it might have seemed at the time. In a world where public figures can feel remote and untouchable, there is something deeply human about a future king and Queen of England showing up at a curling rink in Scotland, trying not to slip on the ice, and sitting down to talk with athletes about their dreams and their work. It signals something. It says, we see you. We know who you are. We are paying attention. And when the time came, when those same athletes were standing on the brink of something remarkable in Italy, William and Catherine's response would carry the full weight of that earlier meeting. The men's curling team that took to the ice at the Milano Cortina 2026 games was one of the most experienced and respected curling squads in the world. Bruce Mouat, the skip, had long been considered one of the finest curlers of his generation, a player of extraordinary tactical intelligence, precision, and composure under pressure. Alongside him were Grant Hardy, Hammy McMillan Jr., and Bobby Lammy, a group of Scottish athletes who had been curling together long enough to have developed the kind of deep, instinctive understanding that separates good teams from truly great ones. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They knew when to push and when to hold back. They had won together, lost together, and come back together enough times to know that the only pressure that ever really breaks a team is the kind you allow in from outside. Their path through the tournament had been one of quiet, relentless excellence. Match by match, they had done what the best curling teams do. They had played smart, they had adapted, and they had refused to panic when things got tight. By the time they reached the semifinals, there was a quiet expectation building among those who had been following the competition closely. This team had the look of champions. The question was not whether they could make the final, it was whether they would let the final be their moment. The semifinal against Switzerland arrived on February 19th, and it was exactly the kind of match that separates the good from the great. Switzerland were not pushovers. They were a technically capable, tactically sharp team who had earned their place in the last four. And the match played out with the kind of tension that makes curling a sport that can sometimes seem slow and cerebral to the uninitiated suddenly feel like the most gripping thing in the world. Every shot carried consequence. Every decision at the board mattered. The crowd was engaged, the commentators were animated, and the four Scottish athletes on the ice were doing what they always did best, thinking clearly, executing calmly, and trusting each other completely. When it ended, Great Britain had won 8-5, a clean, decisive result that belied just how hard-fought the match had actually been. Mouat, Hardy, McMillan Jr., and Lammy had done it. They were in the gold medal final. And with that result, they had also guaranteed something else, something that went beyond their own competition and landed in the broader context of Team GB's incredible games. That semifinal victory meant that Britain now had at least 4 medals from Milano Cortina 2026. 4 medals at a single Winter Olympics, a number that equaled the best total Great Britain had achieved in recent memory. The country reacted with the kind of joy that builds on joy. 3 golds had already arrived. Now curling was in the final. The wave of national pride that had been rising throughout the fortnight suddenly crested in a way that felt almost overwhelming. Sports journalists were filing pieces about Britain's best Winter Olympics in decades. Fans who had never paid attention to curling were suddenly watching clip compilations, learning the rules, figuring out the scoring. The 4 men from Scotland had become, almost overnight, some of the most talked about athletes in the country. And it was in this moment, this charged, electric moment of national celebration, that William and Catherine chose to speak. The message they left was simple. It was not a formal royal statement. It was not a press release distributed through official channels. It was a comment, a personal, direct, human comment, left under the official Team GB post on Instagram, in the way that any person might congratulate someone they actually know and actually care about. Best of luck in the final, Bruce, Grant, Hammy, and Bobby, they wrote. We will be cheering you on. And then, in a detail that said more than any number of formal words could, they signed it simply W&C. Not the Prince and Princess of Wales. Not a formal title or a regal sign-off. Just W&C. 2 letters. 2 people. Cheering on 4 athletes who they had met, spoken with, and genuinely wished well. The reaction to that message was immediate and deeply felt. People who follow the royal family closely noticed the personal nature of it. The use of first names, the signing off with initials rather than titles, the choice to engage on social media in such a direct and human way. People who follow sport noticed it too. The validation that comes when figures of real national significance take the time to acknowledge what athletes are doing. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the people who were simply proud of their country and moved by the thought that in the middle of a week of extraordinary achievement, the future king and queen had taken a moment to say something as simple and warm as, "We see you, we know your names, and we are cheering." There was something about the way William and Catherine had chosen to express their support that felt different from the kind of royal engagement that often fills the news cycle. The formal visits, the ribbon cuttings, the carefully staged photo moments. This was something else. This was 2 people reaching through the screen, across the Alps, to 4 men from Scotland who were about to play the biggest match of their lives. The intimacy of it was striking. The timing of it was perfect. It also reflected something important about how William and Catherine have chosen to carry their roles in recent years, with warmth, with personal investment, and with a genuine desire to connect with the people and causes they champion rather than simply preside over them from a distance. Catherine, who had faced her own extraordinary personal challenges in the years leading up to 2026, had returned to public life with a grace and a renewed sense of purpose that had moved many people. William, steady and serious by nature, had nonetheless shown again and again that he was capable of real warmth when the situation called for it. Together, in that Instagram comment, both of those qualities were on full display. The athletes themselves, of course, were preparing for the final. Canada, a country that breathes curling like most countries breathe air, awaited them. Canada's relationship with the sport is unlike anything else in winter sports. It is not just a hobby or a competition for Canadians. It is part of the national identity, the cultural fabric. Every Canadian curling team that competes at an Olympics carries with them the expectations of millions of people for whom the sport is almost sacred. Winning a gold medal in curling against Canada is not just winning a gold medal. It is winning against the country that considers itself to own the sport. That was the challenge facing Mouat, Hardy, McMillan Jr., and Lamy. For men from Scotland, carrying the hopes of a nation that had just had the most golden week in its Winter Olympic history, stepping onto the ice against the most formidable curling nation on earth. In their corner, among all the coaches and teammates and support staff, was the knowledge that back home, the Prince and Princess of Wales had said they would be watching, that they would be cheering. That W and C were with them. Small things can carry great weight. A note of genuine encouragement from the right person at the right moment can change the atmosphere around a team. It cannot make shots go in that would have missed. It cannot alter the physics of a 44-pound granite stone sliding down 138 feet of pebbled ice. But it can remind athletes of why they do what they do. It can remind them that their effort matters, that their achievement is seen, and that beyond the competition itself, there are people who are proud of them simply for getting there. That is what William and Catherine's message did. It was not just a nice thing to say. It was a reminder at the highest possible level that this team belonged in that final, that they had earned their place, that Britain was behind them, and that whatever happened on the day, they had already made their country proud. The final was set. Canada was waiting. And for Scotsmen, backed by a nation and blessed by a royal message, laced up their shoes and prepared to step onto the ice one more time. There are moments in sport that belong to the athletes alone, moments that happen on the ice or the snow or the track, and cannot be fully explained by anyone watching from the outside. But there are also moments that belong to everyone at once. Moments where the line between the people competing and the people watching dissolves, and for a short time, the whole experience becomes something shared, a single collective feeling that moves through a country like a current through water. The gold medal final of the men's curling at the Milano Cortina 2026 Winter Olympics was one of those moments, and it did not arrive quietly. The morning of the final, Great Britain was already in a state of euphoria that few sporting events could have manufactured. 3 gold medals sat in the Team GB trophy cabinet, each one historic, each one earned through years of dedication that most people outside of sport will never fully understand. Matt Weston had rewritten the record books in skeleton. Charlotte Banks and who Nightingale had made history on the snow. And together, Weston and Tabitha Sturcker had added a third extraordinary chapter to the story. The country had already given itself permission to celebrate. But curling had one more thing to say. Bruce Muat understood the scale of the occasion better than almost anyone. He had been building toward this kind of moment for years. He was the kind of athlete who carries the weight of expectation not as a burden, but as fuel, a competitor who, when the stakes are highest, tends to find something extra rather than something less. His teammates were the same. Grant Hardy, whose precision and calm under pressure had become one of the hallmarks of the team. Hammy McMillan Jr., whose reading of the game and ability to deliver in crucial moments had made him invaluable. Bobby Lammy, whose role in the team was less visible to the casual observer, but just as essential, the kind of player who does the work that allows the stars to shine. Together, they had beaten Switzerland in the semifinal. Together, they had reached the final for the first time in the Olympics. And now they face Canada and everything that meant. The significance of facing Canada in a curling final can barely be overstated. Canada had given the sport to the modern world in many ways. Their players had grown up with curling the same way British children grow up with football. It was the game that filled weekends and dominated conversations and produced champions generation after generation. The Canadian team that arrived at the final was not there by accident. They were there because they had earned it in the same way Muat's team had, through grinding, relentless, technically flawless play throughout the tournament. This was going to be a match worthy of everything that had come before it. From the very first end, it was clear that neither team was going to give anything away cheaply. The tactics were intricate. The shot making was precise. The sweepers worked frantically, reading the ice, calling at each other, adjusting. Muat was at his calculating best, thinking several moves ahead, setting up situations that would pay off ends later. The Canadians responded with their own tactical intelligence, matching Britain move for move, refusing to let the British team find any daylight. For the watching audience, hundreds of thousands of people in Britain alone who had been drawn into curling fever by the events of the past fortnight. It was gripping, edge-of-seat television, the kind that makes you forget to breathe. Back home, the country was in the grip of something close to collective anxiety. People who had been following every British medal with growing excitement now found themselves almost afraid to keep watching. Not because the team seemed likely to lose, but because the stakes felt impossibly high. A fourth gold medal at a single Winter Olympics. Something Great Britain had never done before. Something that, a month earlier, would have seemed like a fantasy. What made it more poignant was the knowledge of who was watching alongside them. William and Catherine had made their feelings known. 2 days earlier, they had reached out, personally, warmly, by first name, and said they would be cheering the team on. For many people following the story, that connection had added an extra layer of meaning to what was already an extraordinary week. It was one thing for a royal family to acknowledge athletic achievement after the fact, in formal statements drafted by communications teams. It was quite another for the future king and queen to leave a personal note of encouragement before the biggest match of 4 athletes' lives, using the same platform that millions of ordinary people use every day to stay connected with the things and the people they care about. That kind of gesture changes the story of an event. It weaves the human and the historic together in a way that makes both feel more real. The athletes were no longer just competitors representing a country. They were Bruce, Grant, Hammy, and Bobby for people with names and faces and histories whose final had been personally acknowledged by the Prince and Princess of Wales. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of detail that people carry with them, that the athletes themselves carry with them, long after the competition is over. The match continued. End after end, the intensity never dropped. The ice remained contested, the margins narrow, the tactical battle evolving with every delivery. Muat marshaled his team with the quiet authority of a captain who trusts his players completely, who does not need to raise his voice because the work they have done together over years has built a foundation of mutual confidence that no single match can shake. Macmillan Jr. swept with focus. Hardy delivered with precision. Lammy read the situation and responded. And bit by bit, through the sheer quality of their play and the depth of their collective intelligence, the British team began to pull away. When it ended, when the final stone of the final end had been delivered, and the scoreboard told the story that the 4 Scottish athletes had spent years trying to write, it was the kind of moment that does not need noise to feel loud. The silence before the celebration is always the truest measure of how much something means. And in that silence, in those few seconds before the shouting and the embracing and the tears, the magnitude of what Muat Hardy Macmillan Jr. and Lammy had done was fully felt. Great Britain had won 4 gold medals at a single Winter Olympics. The record, which had stood unbroken for as long as British Winter Olympic history stretched back, had been shattered. Not chipped away at. Shattered. For golds. On snow and on ice. In skeleton and snowboard cross and curling. By athletes from different backgrounds, different sports, and different stories, all of whom had converged on the same Italian winter and produced something that will be talked about for decades. The reaction from home was everything a moment like that deserves. Social media broke open with pride. Former athletes who had built Britain's previous Olympic reputation posted their congratulations. TV hosts struggled to contain their emotion. Ordinary people, people who had grown up knowing Britain as a Summer Olympics nation, a nation of runners and rowers and cyclists, found themselves watching a curling final with wet eyes and beating hearts. It was the kind of national sporting moment that happens only a handful of times in a generation, the kind that leave a mark. And in among all of it, William and Catherine's earlier message took on an even greater significance. The W&C that had appeared beneath the Team GB Instagram post 2 days before the final was no longer just a warm good luck note. It was a piece of the story. It was the moment when the human connection between the royals and the athletes was made visible, when the private became public and the formal became personal. In 2 letters, the Prince and Princess of Wales had shown who they were as people, not distant, title-bearing public figures going through the motions of royal duty, but 2 individuals who had met these athletes, who knew their names, and who genuinely cared about what happened to them on that final day in Italy. That is no small legacy. In a time when public trust in institutions, royal or otherwise, can feel fragile and uncertain, the authenticity of that gesture mattered. It mattered to the people who saw it. It mattered, surely, to the athletes who received it. And it mattered to the broader story of what the 2026 Winter Olympics came to mean for Great Britain, not just as a sporting achievement, but as a moment of national identity. A moment when the country looked at itself and saw something it liked, something it could be proud of. The four curlers came home to heroes' welcomes. Mouat, Hardy, McMillan Jr., and Lammy had done something that their country will remember for a very long time. Not because they were the loudest or the flashiest, not because their sport fills stadiums or trends on social media on ordinary days, but because when the moment came, they were ready for it. They played the best match of their lives on the biggest stage in the world. They won, and they did it as a team, the same way they had always done everything. The story of Team GB at the Milano Cortina 2026 Winter Olympics is ultimately a story about many things at once. It is a story about athletic excellence, about what happens when preparation, talent, and courage come together at exactly the right time. It is a story about records falling, about a country doing something on the Winter Olympic stage that nobody had done before. It is a story about individuals. Weston touching his medal to make sure it was real, Banks feeling immense relief and overwhelming joy, Sturker becoming the third in a great line of British skeleton champions, Mouat leading his team of Scots to gold against the most formidable curling nation on earth. But it is also a story about connection, about the way sport brings people together, athletes with each other, fans with their teams, countries with their heroes. About how a pair of initials at the bottom of an Instagram comment can speak volumes about who a person really is. About how warmth, offered genuinely and at the right moment, can become part of the fabric of a story that would have been remarkable regardless, and make it feel even more so. William and Catherine sent their message before the final. They did not know the result when they wrote it. They did not know, when they put down those two letters, that they were adding their names to the story of Britain's greatest ever Winter Olympics. They just knew four athletes who were about to play the most important match of their lives. And they wanted them to know that they were seen, that they were valued, and that the whole country was behind them. That is what they gave. And in a week full of gold medals and broken records and moments that will live in British sporting memory for generations, it was one of the most quietly powerful gestures of all.